advance of the 37th session of the World Health Assembly that will take place next week. This event is hosted and was organized by a couple of organizations that normally around this time of the year would meet in Geneva: Health Action International, Knowledge Ecology International, Wemos, the Pharmaceutical Accountability Foundation, and Medicines Law and Policy. My name is Hoen. I am the head of Medicines Law and Policy, and I will be your moderator today. I have never done this online. I've often done this in Geneva, so I hope all will go as smoothly as it usually goes. I should say this is possibly the largest World Health Assembly side event we have ever organized. We have over 500 people registered for the event. Many more requests, therefore we're also live streaming on YouTube on the Health Action International channel. We have a number of very impressive speakers on the panel. I want to mention up front, because we've had questions about that on social media. We had also invited CEPI and FIND to be represented today, but they were unfortunately not available. These are, of course, busy times with many competing events taking place. We have an impressive panel, and I welcome you all. By way of introduction, we've seen over the last few weeks a number of very important events and an unprecedented fundraising effort for COVID-19 health product development. We have heard world leaders talk about the need to develop new technologies, and that those technologies, and in particular the vaccine, need to be a global public good. Even today, an impressive group of world leaders called for a people's vaccine for all, referring to the need for this to be openly and the IP being accessible. But we have not heard a great deal about the modalities as to how to get there. Saying that something should be a global public good doesn't make it so, and that is sort of the theme of this session. I should single out the exception. Costa Rica, of course, has proposed to the World Health Organization to establish a COVID-19 technology pool that will bring together the rights to technologies, therapeutics, vaccines, IP, data, know-how, etc., to ensure that production and supply can take place at a scale large enough to have an effective response to the pandemic. A brief practical announcement before I kick off the panel. You will have noticed there's a Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. We ask you to post your questions on the chat if the name of the person you would like to ask the question for. Should there be time left at the end of the panel's introductions, we will turn to those questions. We will also try to answer some of these questions as we go along, if that is indeed possible. Because of the large number of attendees, it's not possible to have microphones open and have people participate in the conversation. The meeting will be broadcast. It will also be recorded, so you can always look back if you've missed some of it. So let me quickly run through the list of speakers. We have the following people will make brief introductions. Minister Daniel Salas, Minister of Health of Costa Rica. Roman Macaya, who is the Executive President of the Board of Directors of the Costa Rican Social Security Fund. Dr. Mariângela Simão, Assistant Director General, Access to Medicines and Health Products of the World Health Organization. Mr. James Love, Director, Knowledge Ecology International. Mr. Paul Fehlner, President and CEO of Revision Therapeutics. Dr. Marie-Paule Kieny, Director of Research at Inserm. Philippe Duneton, Executive Director of Unitaid. Dr. Carlos Correa, Executive Director of the South Center. Dr. Bernard Picoul, Executive Director of the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative. And Charles Gore, Executive Director of the Medicines Patent Pool. Each of them know that they have 5 minutes to respond to a question which I will pose to them per introduction. If this had been a live event, you know that if you talk longer than 5 minutes, you get the evil eye. I'm not quite sure how you do that electronically, but I ask you to stick within the time limits, because at some point we will simply run out of time and we will not have the opportunity today to say, well, we'll continue our conversation over a drink at the reception, because unfortunately that is not possible in a virtual event, one of the many things I'm sure we all miss. Without further ado, I would like to invite Minister Daniel Salas with a very warm welcome to this panel, and ask him and subsequently Mr. Roman Macaya to talk to us a little bit about their proposal to their initiative to propose the COVID-19 pool to the WHO. Tell us why you took that initiative, and were you surprised by the support of it? Minister Salas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for all the participants and people who has been organizing this meeting. We since health and diseases do not recognize barriers, solidarity and joint work become essential to face different threats. And this has been evidenced in the context of the challenges that the COVID-19 pandemic represents and has brought to the world. And where no country in the world has the capacity to stop the pandemic on its own. And where no country in the world has the capacity to face the consequences of this pandemic in its own effort. So we really consider that we should join all the knowledge, all the technology, all that has been brought to science to combat this virus. But this requires that we really do an effort to go further than we normally do, and that we should try to put in a patent pool all those resources, all those technologies, all those knowledges that we do have right now, and probably the ones that are running right now to be discovered to help us, to aid us to combat this pandemic. So I know that this requires that we do an effort, as I told further, not just in the health aspect or in the health topic, but is some kind of humanitarian effort that we should do. And I know that there are a lot of investigation, a lot of research, a lot of technology that right now is helping some countries to combat this COVID-19 pandemic. But we really need that those countries that are now having all those technologies at hand to combat this pandemic, that they see that this is a world topic. A lot of people are dying right now. A lot of people are suffering the consequences of this, not just in the health sphere, but in a social, in the economic aspects. And if we do not unite, if we do not see these as a world topic, as a world challenge, we are going to lose as a joint world. So that's why we are proposing to have this patent pool, this repository, so the world can put in there all that knowledge, all those technologies, all the things that that really help us to combat this virus in a enhanced, in a joint way. And we know that WHO is leading this effort, and we would like to raise this awareness to the world so that we receive all the support, all the backup that is needed for this kind of initiative, so that we can really move forward and have that repository, that patent pool, become a reality.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister Salas. I would like to thank you for your initiative, and we will hear, of course, from others how they have responded to that, including from the WHO. But before I turn to the WHO, I would like to ask Mr. Roman Macaya to say a few words and perhaps talk a little bit about the responses that he has received, or that your country has received so far to your initiative. Mr. Macaya. You need to unmute, Mr. Macaya. Could you unmute?
Sorry. Okay, can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation to this event. I'm going to talk about this from the perspective of an institution that would be a user of the pool. The Caja Costarricense de Seguro Social, as it's named in Spanish, is our healthcare provider in Costa Rica for public healthcare services. It's a universal coverage model, and it's essentially a single payer, single. So we have to ensure having all the technologies, whether they're drugs, personal protective equipment, diagnostic kits, all types of technology to treat our patients, and in whatever we can help to diagnose those new cases. What we are finding is that access to technologies is very challenging these days. On the positive side, I'll start out there. There's a lot of innovation happening. I mean, if we think about it, everything that's developed specifically for COVID-19 has been developed in the last 4 to 5 months tops. So there's a very quick innovation that's happening worldwide, but access to those technologies has been a major challenge. We have found that when we place orders for supplies, equipment, reagents, and so forth, that there's a very long backlog. We are having severe delays in deliveries. And also, we're finding that sometimes these technologies are deemed strategic. So there are priorities that are given to these technologies within borders, and sometimes even export bans on these technologies. And so this is why we believe that access to this is essential, and that we can only provide true access if we work collectively. We have had to do things such as contracting charter planes to go to China to pick up equipment, because the logistics are so chaotic that if we wait for this to be scheduled by a normal route, it would not arrive in time. And there's a whole challenge about contracting even the logistical pickups to this. But I'd like to point out that Costa Rica will not only be a user of such a pool from a demand point of view, but also from a supply point of view. We are innovating ourselves. There are 3 therapeutic strategies that are being explored right now. One is to look at convalescent plasma effects. So taking the plasma from recovered patients. We have started collecting plasma last week, and hopefully we'll be treating patients next week. We're also working on purifying the antibodies from that convalescent plasma. That'll be available a little later. And then also developing purified antibodies from horses. This is a strategy that has been implemented for a number of years, many decades actually, by our Clodomiro Picado Institute, which is a reference center for snake bites with WHO. And it's the exact same technology for developing these heterologous antibodies for against COVID-19 proteins, or the coronavirus proteins. We're also developing technology with our cell phones, although we are not tracking patients, but patients can download the app and enter their symptoms, and they get stratified according to risk as high, medium, and low. And that helps them sort of motivate them to go get a test if necessary. There's been a tremendous interest in this. That application has been downloaded over 2 million times in a country of only 5 million people as a population. But this is something that was developed within our health system. And there also has been some ventilator design work. And we are, as I mentioned, users or would-be users of this pool, but from both sides, the demand side and the supply side. And what motivates us to propose or to support this initiative is what we're seeing on the ground. The logistics and the actual supply of technologies that are being developed has been severely limited by an over demand worldwide, and by logistics chains that are interrupted simply because of this over demand, or by legal reasons or strategic decisions that are happening within borders.
Thank you, Mr. Macaya, and again, thank you for your initiative and for this very interesting introduction, and important that you say will be contributors to the pool, but we'll as users, your interest comes from both sides. You've made the proposal to the WHO. Our next speaker is representing that organization, Dr. Mariângela Simão, Assistant Director General at the World Health Organization. Mariângela, I hope you can hear me. I would like to ask you to take the floor and respond. You have a very heavy responsibility in ensuring the fair distribution of vaccines, still to be developed therapeutics and diagnostics needed in response to the pandemic. And how does WHO see how the COVID-19 pool could help in that? Mariângela, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Helen, and hello to colleagues. I've seen the faces that I haven't seen in a long time. I saw Bernard Picot with a new look, longer hair and a beard. You're looking very good. First, let me thank the organizer for inviting WHO to come in, and I'd like to say a few things first on the broader context, because there are two things that this pandemic has made crystal clear. First is that we are one world that has more in common than we ever envisaged. You know, we are so interdependent. You know, there's so many common interests. Like you take the globalized trade or the supply chains and our concerns. For example, when the essential medicines, when China went into lockdown, and then in India, and the extremely concentration of APIs production in certain countries, everything, it makes crystal clear we are just one big globe. The second is that the best defense against outbreaks, WHO has been saying for a long time, is preparedness, investing in strong health systems, universal health coverage. That includes access to quality primary health care and health products. And this crisis has proved we are not there. We are far behind. And let me say that in a way that this virus has shown to be very democratic. You know, it reminds me strongly of the early days of HIV, when we had HIV as a global threat affecting with cases in all countries. It also reminds me every day that where we don't want to be in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. We don't want to end up like HIV, where there's still a higher incidence, new cases coming up in poor countries, on the low and middle income countries, or in vulnerable communities in resource-rich countries. So that's where we don't want to end up. And what's happening right now, we see that the early serological studies are showing that in countries that went through the first wave already, they're showing that a large proportion of the population is still susceptible to COVID-19. Switzerland, right? Gone the first wave, 9.7% of the population has immunity. So it's not over, far from over. You all know there is a huge effort globally to produce vaccines and medicines for treatment and prevention for this new coronavirus. And some of the colleagues who speak today, and Philippe Duneton, I believe, will speak, are heavily engaged in the ACT Accelerator, which is actually congregating the efforts for many partners to ensure that we have a safe, effective, affordable products in the shortest time possible. But we also are deeply convinced that it's not enough just to have these tools available. Now, we need to have equitable access and a fair allocation mechanism in place, and that's not an easy task, because access is ultimately a political decision. We may have the best allocation plan in the world. If the political decision is not in place in the different countries to have an effort to ensure equitable access, we won't get anywhere. And the WHO's DG, you know that the WHO's been under heavy criticism, and he has recently said that we need peace for health and health for peace. And he urged all stakeholders to put aside politics and prioritize a global ceasefire so we can end this pandemic together. Why am I saying this? Because the same should apply to traditional market rules, right? Because we need solidarity within and between countries and private sector, and it's essential this if we are ever to overcome the barriers we see on this time. And we are seeing for the first time ever some good examples where companies, the private sector is coming out with solidarity approaches, from open licensing and support to tech transfer to commitment to, for example, to not increase prices when there was a shortage of like essential medicines. So we expect that several of the elements of the call for action championed by Costa Rica and other countries will resonate with many countries, industry, researchers, and others. Sharing knowledge, intellectual property data will help us leverage the collective efforts to advance scientific discovery, technology development, broad sharing of benefits of the scientific applications, and so on. But we also need to see the world through a different lens, you know, and we are struggling with that. I think this is, can we think of a fair allocation or equitable access if we are just considering countries' income levels? You know, are we talking again about poor countries getting medicines or vaccines for free, about middle income countries having affordable access to products? We have another set of context right now. For example, we have countries, it's not only low and middle income countries, right? We have countries who are manufacturing products and countries who are not manufacturing products. And these are developed countries and developing countries. So those who don't have manufacturing capacity, be them rich countries or middle income countries, they are all worried about what will happen to them when, if, for example, there's concern about increased nationalism and if one country decides unilaterally to retain all the production. I think Roman has cited some problems they had with PPEs and ventilators, medical devices, and so on. So I think the question is very much what will be the new normal after this epidemic is over. You know, in many aspects, we're talking about new normal in behavior and in our society and everything, but from the health perspective, I'd like to recall someone that I respect very much, Sir Michael Marmot, when he said that inequities in health are unjust and are preventable. So we may not be able to do much on the microeconomic trends or how the world will deal with economic crisis that this pandemic is causing from the health sector side. But we sure can do our best to influence how the economics of good health or health for all first should like in a fairer world. You know, and I think this is what this call is calling for. Equitable access in a transformed world towards universal health coverage and health for all. Thank you very much, Ellen.
Thank you, Mariângela. Very wise words. You talk about the new normal, and the new normal should also come with new norms, because without those, it's going to be very difficult to make a great deal of progress, and that's of course what we're discussing. I'm very pleased to introduce to you the next speaker, James Love, Director of Knowledge Ecology International. Jamie, I hope you're on the call. I can't see you quite, but that's probably because of my own setup. You've been a very vocal advocate of the COVID pool. Some people are saying this doesn't go far. This doesn't go far enough. There are, of course, also voices out there who don't want to see it at all, but there's concern about this being of a voluntary nature, and they argue that it should be a compulsory mechanism. What is your response to that? The floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Great. Let me set my timer here so I don't go over. I hope you can hear me okay. First, I think if governments can resolve things through policy, for example, I know that Germany has passed legislation for automatic compulsory licensing of COVID-19 technologies, and Canada has amended its law, and there's been actions in Israel, Ecuador, Chile, and other countries to sort of, in discussions, I understand, in some European countries to move toward non-voluntary licensing. And I also think that if there's a vaccine that's out there that works, or a drug that works, or some preventive technology that actually works, the public is going to demand that countries act, and they're not going to care what the intellectual property rules are, and there will be a lot of non-voluntary action. So I think that, and I think that also should influence the people that are holders of IP about whether or not they want to sort of go down that road, if they're reticent to open up their technology. I think that the main high-level message is that there should not be any monopolies in this pandemic, that you're going to have supply constraints, unequal access. And it's one thing for people to be hoarding products through their purchasing power and things like that. It's another thing for them to hoard IP and know-how. I think that that's sort of a different level of antisocial behavior if you don't allow other people to make products that you can't even supply the market for yourself, or can't do it at a price that's affordable. So I think that the high-level message is should be really no monopolies. Now, why is voluntary licensing important? Well, I've worked on compulsory licensing. I worked on the Nexavar case in India. I worked on the TAC case in South Africa. I've worked with the Chilean civil society, legislators, and the government on compulsory license. We worked in Colombia and all sorts of different countries, Mozambique, Cameroon, etc., and the United States, as well as Europe. And I can tell you, it's possible. It's certainly, there's certainly a green light within international legal mechanisms. Usually the problems are the national laws are not very good in most countries. And often there's significant delays involved in compulsory licensing not under international rules, but under national legislation. Some countries have never issued a compulsory license, and because they've never issued a compulsory license, they may not have the proper procedures in place. In some countries we've worked in, they don't even know which part of the government is supposed to take the lead on things, or what type of followings to do. It's not the same everywhere. Some countries are able to execute a compulsory license. There's some positive legislation in some countries, some bad legislation in others. But things would go much faster and be much more inclusive. Another problem with compulsory license, and some countries will feel that they cannot export to other countries under compulsory licensing rules. I mean, I think all these things are fixable, but you're talking about controversies, lawyers, complexities that most people that have not worked in compulsory license are perhaps not familiar with. For example, there's some 37 countries that have opted out as importers under WTO rules under the TRIPS 31 best procedures. I think that's a bad decision. I think they should reverse that decision in this pandemic. And we signed letters with others to get them to do that. But that's an example of something that's out there. Professor Correa has identified some provisions in the TRIPS which are really helpful. And I think that countries should explore those. And he's a good advisor on all of these things. But at the end of the day, because of all the problems in national legislation, sorry, I should have turned off my phone here. Anyway, but because of the problems of the national legislation, a voluntary license becomes quite an important option. If it's there, I mean, you kind of got to go with what you got. In some cases, there'll be no patents. In other cases, there are patents. If you can't get voluntary licensing, countries should really go to compulsory licensing. There should be no monopolies in the pandemic. And it's also right that this is something that's really focused on all technologies, all products, and will involve different players, I believe. GIS aid, GIS aid is something the German government supports. It's one of the places where people have been sharing sequencing data on the virus. They have a good relationship with the scientists that work in this area. They've worked out the details in terms of the terms of reference for that. The Medicines Patent Pool has a record of licensing both patents, know-how, and regulatory test data. Sometimes requires nuances that people that haven't done this probably are not aware of. There are going to be other agencies involved in tech transfer activities. We don't know exactly who's going to step up in the vaccine. We're really concerned about the fact that CEPI, that Dick Wilder has made a statement that CEPI will not support open licensing of vaccine technology, even when the funders are from governments or from charities. And I think that's really appalling. If there's a vaccine out there that works, it should be out there everywhere. And what should be done right now, and I'll conclude with this, is the WHO and other parties should be identifying for every vaccine that's under development, all the people that have the physical capacity and the staff that's capable of manufacturing that vaccine, if it actually proves up, given if they get a sufficient amount of either access to the IP, but also the know-how and biologic resources that are necessary. So everything right now should be preparing to scale up as fast as possible, use as many manufacturers as possible, and have no monopolies on any of these technologies. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. That was very clear. No monopolies in this in this pandemic, and there are different ways to get there, but a global mechanism where, in sort of the spirit of solidarity, people come together would of course be great. I'm going to slightly shift the order of the speakers because I was just informed that Dr. Philippe Duneton, the Executive Director of Unitaid, may have to leave a little earlier, and he is worried that he may not make it if I stick to the order. So I would like to invite Philippe. Are you on the panel to take the floor? Unitaid was very swift in expressing support for the proposal by Costa Rica. Could you say a few words about how you will support this project and how you will work to bring more countries in to make this happen? Philippe, you have the floor.
Thank you, Hélène, and good afternoon for all the participants, and maybe for certain of you, good morning. I just want to echo what was said before, in particular about Mariângela from WHO, because why we were so kind to look at this proposal. It's first because we know and we have learned from very difficult time that what was the situation with HIV, and a lot of work that we have been doing, by the way, with you, Hélène, and the Medicine Patent Pool also, is to face the situation and starting to recognize that the COVID-19 is a threat for all the country, but specifically for the most vulnerable people, which is always the case for the pandemic. Directly, of course, but also indirectly, and I want to also flag the fact that for the people who are already in need of treatment, I think that some issues and more issues will come in terms of how they access to the services they need, and also the food security that is also a question in most of the country that are in low resource settings. So I think that's the principle, and you mentioned that equitable access was recognized, but I want to start with that, because we need the political support, and I think that the fact that it's a global threat and everybody recognizes that we need to global solution is something very important. So when I'm hearing President Macron, the President of the Commission, European Commission, and the head of state, of course, the head of Costa Rica, but Germany and all, that are very keen to say that, yes, we need a common effort is very, very important. I think that we have learned also that global solution means to work with different partners. We need also, of course, the industry, and I just see that industry has already commit to global solution, but I think that we need to make sure that we understand the same when we are talking about equitable access. We need also the support for civil society and communities, because that's the way we work. And we know that it's also to work on the principle of access, but also the reality of access at country level. And we know that if we need to have this also engagement with the civil society and community to make it work, because it's not just to have the product, but how to use it. So a couple of thoughts how we can support this initiative. First, I think, again, it was explained in the previous, and Jimmy has made the point that, I mean, we need to recognize that all the countries are in need of new technology at the same time, from the north, from the south, for the country who can manufacture the product, the other who cannot. And this needs to be taken into consideration. So again, I think that in terms of capacity, even if we have the new technology, the new vaccine, the new test, the new medicine to treat or to test and treat, it's unlikely that only one manufacturer can deliver on that. That's the reason why we need to have this cooperation, and to make sure that there is no barrier that should be raised for that. So that's the first point. I think that there is a need on advocacy. The second is we are ready to support actively the medicine patent pool, because we believe that if we have a political commitment, we need also to have the technical implementation. And of course, we need, as our work through the ACT intervention and accelerator, we need to put into place this commitment into reality. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Philippe. Can I, you didn't use your full 5 minutes, so I want to do a quick follow-up question. Have you had any contacts with CEPI around this COVID-19 pool? Isn't that an entity that should get more centrally involved in this?
Yes, I did. So I think that not yesterday or today, but we discussed, and I think that we need also to take into consideration the specificities of the development of each of the products. So I think IP are important, but also other type of intervention are important. And again, potentially to take into consideration what cost plus intervention can lead, but also transfer of technology or transfer of knowledge, and also quality principle, because the biologic, it would be the same, by the way, for the medicines that are biologics, because we will face exactly the same difficulties. But yes, I think on the principle, we have a good, at least interaction and understanding, but I mean, we need, again, what I was saying is we need to get to the specific.
Thank you very much, Philippe. And on that same theme, we will continue to talk a little bit more about the role of funders. Our next speaker will be Paul Fehlner. He's the president and CEO of Revision Therapeutics, and Paul has extensive experience within the private sector in large pharmaceutical companies. And I would like him to comment on the question how the donors, the funders of COVID-19 related research and development can help. We know that 7.4 billion was pledged for mostly for product development and policies to ensure equitable access. Now, isn't this the time to attach conditions to such funding, and what if that does not happen? Paul, you have the floor.
Ellen, thank you very much. Thanks so much for the honor of being invited to participate in this panel today, and for the work that's going on to address COVID-19 and as people have pointed out, hopefully lay the foundation for a new normal that is more collaborative. In my view, the funders have incredible discretion, as we know they have, for determining how their funding is used. We seem to have no objection to funders imposing regular controls on how a company it funds is operated, who the CEO is, how the stock is allocated, where the profits go. It's entirely consistent with that model for funders to insist on contribution of assets to this pool in order to ensure more rapid and accelerated development of products. And I'd like to go into that a little bit further because, frankly, the pool has great potential to leverage knowledge and significantly accelerate from every level the advancement of projects. This will be especially true if the pool contains, as quickly as possible, clinical data and the raw data so that people could really get into it and understand it. Regulatory filings so that it's possible to understand the procedures that people are going through and adapt them for other products, whether vaccines or therapeutics, to address COVID-19, rather than wait months or even years for publication in the literature or other access to dossiers. And from a funder perspective, insisting on the sharing of the output from the funded entity is consistent with also that entity accessing the shared information so that their own work can proceed at a more rapid pace. It makes no sense to me for funders to pay for rework, pay to create wheels that have already been created, when by accessing the information in the pool, they can bypass that and move more quickly to solutions. Now is a great time for funders to start to attach these conditions because the environment is certainly highly collaborative. I don't think there's a time in history where we've seen 15 of the top multinational pharmaceutical companies, plus one of the leading funders of medical research, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, enter into a collaborative posture where they are sharing their own libraries, research, and other assets to accelerate solutions to COVID-19. And frankly, if multinational corporations, who at the end of the day are publicly owned and obliged to, under the terms of the stock sales that they've undertaken, turn a profit and be profitable, for them to enter into this is a great example of the advantages of a collaborative, cooperative posture in the context of COVID-19 technology. And there's no excuse for anyone not to follow this lead and expand it on a worldwide basis to really ensure that both the, and as Mr. Macaya pointed out, that there's both contribution and withdrawal to accelerate the process of COVID-19 therapeutics, vaccines, protective materials, and diagnostic assays. So I think that, and once we've established this model, it is something that could start to be a foundation for carrying forward in the future. The final reason why it's critically important to establish it now is that the environment is open to it now, and there needs to be a mechanism to ensure that this is in place so that in the future, as we start to revert to the mean, the openness that's established here will continue. To this end, I would think that funders should absolutely insist that the funding recipients contribute to the pool and use the pool. And I also think that there should be a mechanism, as in other open access platforms, for anyone who uses the pool to commit to contributing to it, to commit to making the results of their access to the pool open and collaborative, so that there's a fairness to this. And we've seen where these types of operations exist, and pools that with effective mechanisms for contribution as well as withdrawal, accelerate processes and lead to significant advances much more quickly than would happen if we pursue the standard and conventional process of closed research and competitive posturing. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to leave things there.
Thank you, Paul. And that was an excellent introduction to the next speaker, Marie-Paule Kieny, Director of Research at Inserm. She's also the chair of the board of the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative and the Medicines Patent Pool. And Marie-Paule, I would like to ask you, with your hat on as head of research, with your hat on as researcher, can you speak about how the research community can contribute to the COVID-19 technology pool? As previous speakers already touched upon, the research world is highly collaborative, and we really see unprecedented open collaboration and a great deal of solidarity going on there. And how do we make sure that that remains when this research goes further downstream, closer to product level? Marie-Paule, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ellen. It's a pleasure to have been invited to speak on this distinguished panel. So the academic research community can contribute to the COVID-19 response and to the COVID-19 technology pool in several ways. First, I believe that the traditional role of academic researchers with regards to providing leadership in developing research priority and safeguarding best practices in research is as important as ever in this crisis. For example, we have witnessed clinical studies of varying quality for many different potential COVID-19 drug candidates. Some studies are open label, some blinded, some placebo controlled, some with no control arm, some are observational, and some are interventional. Academic researchers should make sure the necessary trial appropriately powered to assess safety and effectiveness of different interventions take place, and avoid trying to push for their own in-house solution based on small, underpowered, limited scope studies for their preferred compound. Larger trials, such as the discovery trial led by Inserm, the organization I work for, or the discovery trial in the UK, should be favored, as well as multi-country initiatives, such as the WHO Solidarity Trial. Without this, we don't even know which IP we want to pool. On the topic of cooperation and coordination, it is essential that researchers share their data rapidly and efficiently. The fast-tracked approaches for peer reviewing key COVID-19 science that some scientific journals have implemented is helpful, as is the flexibility of being able to share manuscripts in advance of publication on platforms such as Medrex, as long as that does not mean that improperly reviewed and vetted science gets published. We have seen how much this can be detrimental. For example, as had happened with anecdotal studies published claiming the game-changing benefits of hydroxychloroquine. Besides conducting well-designed clinical trials and ensuring adequate data is produced out of those trials, researchers across a variety of fields have a role to play in translating science to innovative, scalable, usable technologies that can be used to address the COVID-19 pandemic and where the IP can be pooled. Ensuring that intervention can be scaled up also in low and middle income countries, and in fact that preceding research and development efforts take place also in this country is essential, as recently highlighted by the COVID-19 Clinical Research Coalition, which includes organizations like DNDi, FIND, the Gates Foundation, Wellcome Trust. Finally, with regards to their specific contribution to the COVID-19 technology pool, I think that researchers can ensure that any intellectual property, patents, know-how, and others that has previously or is expected to come out of their research and could be useful to the COVID-19 response can be used at both the speed and scale called for by this pandemic. Contributing IP to the COVID-19 technology pool is one approach to ensuring that. Having a single, centralized, transparent, and public health focused pool for COVID-19 technologies may be more effective and avoid dispersion of effort and confusion, especially if led by the WHO in collaboration with the Medicines Patent Pool. In conclusion, I believe that the academic research community not only can contribute to the COVID-19 response, but also has a number of important responsibilities in doing so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marie-Paule. That was very, very clear, and I hope that you can also, with your institute, play a role in making sure that the French government supports this initiative, because we need more pieces of the puzzle to push this forward. Thank you very much for your intervention and for the support by the Medicines Patent Pool, of course, and we'll hear from them later on in the program. Our next speaker is Dr. Carlos Correa. He is the Executive Director of the South Center. Good afternoon, Dr. Correa. I would like to pose the following question to you. There's a lot of concern amongst countries that do not have vaccine development capacity about access to COVID-19 vaccines, potential COVID-19 vaccines, I should say, because the vaccine or vaccines still do not exist. A lot of work is going on in that area, but we haven't got a vaccine yet. But concern exists already how this will be made available once they are developed. How are those countries preparing? Are they preparing, and how can a pool like this help in that? And if you could also perhaps say a few words about the manufacturing capacity in countries around the world. Some of the attendees have asked questions on the Q&A about that. Is there actually capacity in the developing world to produce products that are technologically somewhat more advanced? Dr. Correa, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Ellen. Thank you for the invitation to participate at this meeting. It's very nice to meet virtually many friends and colleagues, and many of them I cannot see because we cannot see all the participants. But let me just start by indicating the importance of the initiative by the President of Costa Rica, and to congratulate the Minister Salas and Roman Macaya, the health team in Costa Rica, for having devised this mechanism, which is, I think it's very important to note that this mechanism is based on a very important concept. And this is a concept of the tools to address COVID-19 should be global public goods. There have been discussions this week, as you may know, about whether this is a too abstract or academic concept. But indeed, the concept of global public good is quite concrete. It does mean that all tools, technologies, products, vaccines should be available, as Philippe and the President of the Board of Unitaid have said, should be available to all, everywhere at the same time. So this is in essence what this pool should aim at, and other instruments that may be used should achieve. But then coming in particular to your question, I think that the concerns that you are mentioning are justified. In order for this for pool to work and be successful, there are a number of conditions that need to be met, and I will mention some of these conditions. One is the role of the civil society, and this webinar itself is already an expression of the role that civil society may play. Also, the letter that a large number of NGOs have sent in support of this initiative is also a good expression. I think the role of civil society is extremely important in order to induce, to convince the right owners that they need to be partners in this initiative. So if this does not happen, if governments are not pushing for this, if the enterprise world is not convinced that there are advantages and there is also solidarity behind these efforts, there will be no possible success for this initiative. The second condition has already been mentioned. This is what funders can do. As you know, the US government has given already 1 billion to Johnson & Johnson. The European Commission has been able to raise significant money, $8 billion. So a major question is under what conditions this funding is provided. And certainly the funders including governments, have all the rights, all the possibilities to include as one condition in order to get this support, to ensure that the outcomes of the research is part of this pool becomes actually a global public good. So it is in their hands actually to act ex ante and not to wait until a product or technology is developed in order to try to convince that some particular pattern of conduct should be followed. So I think there is a major role to be played by funders in this respect. A third condition, and Marie-Paule has already mentioned the contribution of science. That's very important, really. In order to develop vaccines, you need a very strong science. But we need to be careful because, as you may also know, in the past, many scientists have been very much seduced by the concept that they need to get patents on whatever they produce. So this has become a pattern in many universities around the world, not only developed countries, also in developing countries. And this then may lead to a different paradigm in which open science is not what prevails. And this in particular, in this context, is very important to stress. So scientists should come back to the old paradigm of open science. For instance, there is a recent example of a patent which was granted in the United States to the Tel Aviv University, which seems to be very proud of getting this patent. This patent actually refers to a COVID vaccine design, and then it seems to go in the wrong direction. So scientists should, as was expressed by Marie-Paule very convincingly, should be part of a world in which science is open and they contribute to the pool of knowledge in order to make reality access to vaccines to all at the same time in developing countries. So the fourth condition relates to the government's role. And I'm coming to your question, to the second question, or the second part of your question regarding manufacturing capacities. So governments need to provide incentives for right holders to participate in the pool. As we know, it was already mentioned. So companies are there in order to make profits. And therefore, without incentives, many of them will not be prepared actually. There may be good intention, but there will be no, in fact, the outcome that we expect. So therefore, governments should think of incentives for their companies to actually participate in this pooling of technology and knowledge. There is Article 66, paragraph 2 in the TRIPS agreement that many of you are familiar with, which provides an obligation for developed countries to provide incentives for the transfer of technology to least developed countries through incentives to their own enterprise and entities. And I think, although this is not certainly the same context, but a model like this should be used in this case in order for the governments to actually provide incentives for the companies to participate. In terms of production capacity, this is another issue in which governments should also take a role. Just coming to your question, production capacity in vaccine is very limited. As you know, production is dominated by an oligopoly at the world level. There are 4 companies that control 80–90% of the vaccine supply. There is some capacity in a number of developing countries. There's the case of India, the Serum Institute, the case of Argentina. Some private companies are producing vaccines, the case of Colombia, of China today. But there is a need to make a major effort to increase manufacturing capacity. There is no question that the existing producer of vaccines, they will not be able to supply billions of doses of vaccines when this is developed. So, for instance, in the case of Sanofi, they inform that they will be able, if they get the vaccine, to produce between 100 million and 600 million doses a year, depending on the platform for the vaccine. This certainly will not be sufficient. So governments should also take a role in promoting investment. Investments in manufacturing plant for vaccines is higher as compared to manufacturing plants for chemical compounds. Technologies are more complex. Also, there is a need to get access to know-how. This has been referred to. just getting access to information, providing a patent is not enough. In general, the patent does not provide all necessary information. So access to know-how is important. There will be a need for cooperation, including South-South cooperation, in order to make this a reality. So production capacity is a major issue, is a major issue of concern, and there may be active interventions in order to expand this capacity. Otherwise, there will be no way in which everybody will be able to get access to vaccines and affordable prices. In the current situation, this will not be possible. Then, fifth condition, and I'm just finished, is to promote certainly the pool that's been proposed, but without forgetting that this is an instrument among other instruments. And Jamie has already mentioned compulsory licensing, government use, which we can utilize quite straightforward by governments. Also, the national security clause in Article 73B of the TRIPS agreement. So there are other tools. So all these tools must be available. Governments should be aware of in order to ensure that this public good, global public good, is finally created. And then finally, a very short reference to the role of the World Health Organization. In implementing the pool, the World Health Organization should not have just a passive role, just not to get information what is being donated, what technology made available. I think it should have an active role in terms of interacting with governments, interacting with right holders in order to ensure that these technologies are made available. Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you, Carlos. That was very clear, and I think it's very important to indeed stress that this COVID-19 pool should not only hold the necessary intellectual property, but also should be a vehicle to transfer the knowledge and know-how, technology that is necessary to produce the essential products. So very important to stipulate that. The next speaker, I'm sure, will take the conversation about what else is needed, what are the various elements of progress a little further. Bernard Piccoul, who is the director of the Drugs for Neglected Diseases initiative. Welcome, Bernard. The recent pledging conference has brought together vast amounts of money, 7.5 billion for the development of products. There's a lot of talk about this money going towards the development of global public good, but that remains talk if action is not taken to make it happen. Could you say a few words about what the various elements towards further progress to making this global public goods are? Bernard, you have the floor.
Thanks, Hélène. Good afternoon or good morning to all of you. While COVID-19 is unique in its global scale, many of the challenges it weighs in relation to lack of effective treatment and vaccines, and concern about whether tools will be usable, available, or affordable to all countries, and in particular to resource-limiting settings, are very familiar to me, both as an infectious diseases doctor, but as the head of DNDi, dedicated to research and development for a very neglected population. Many of the challenges we face have the same obstacles the government will debate at the World Health Assembly. I want to share some of our experience here and the action that must be taken to turn commitments into tangible health tools in the hand of clinicians and patients. Just as the COVID crisis is extraordinary in its magnitude, our response must be unequal in its ambition. We need strong political leadership, as Costa Rica and others are showing today, and bold action. It cannot be business as usual. We are already seeing many positive developments, including the use of open science and collaboration to understand the virus. We have seen a major investment in research and development for new health technology, and private and public sectors take some proactive steps to remove barriers to knowledge, data sharing, and intellectual property. But We have also seen some worrying development that may defeat our common ambition, including governments focusing on national access rather than global, and private sector thinking to exclude countries from voluntary licenses. We saw this before in response to HIV and more recently in response to hepatitis C. So I would like to propose 5 actions which I believe are critical in the next phase. First, member states have to remain in a driving seat. All countries must be involved. We need to identify the tools and interventions that are the most appropriate and effective in a widely different settings and different countries. Researchers and public health leaders from low and middle income countries are both the most legitimate and the most likely to identify what works best for the population. Second, we need global open sharing of research knowledge and data. We know from experience that open science in real time improves efficiency and accelerates scientific progress. Countries and other funders are critical to help ensure this happens. Funding should be conditional on results and data being shared in the public domain. Third, we need health tools to be free of intellectual property restriction. DNDi supports all ways to remove such barriers. We have shown it is possible to reach agreement with the right holders to remove barriers, but the terms of agreement are critical. A global pool offers one solution and is an important alternative to the more restrictive licenses we are starting to see, provided that the licenses are truly globally and on a non-exclusive basis. It will require willingness from both technology owners and governments in leveraging their investment. It is preferable that to be voluntary, but if not, the global community must be able to remove barriers using TRIPS flexibility, as that's been mentioned several times before. Fourth, we must act now to ensure sufficient production, equitable allocation, and affordable pricing. The greatest challenge of all may be ensuring that enough quality assured tests, treatment, vaccine, and other essential equipment are manufactured. Increasing existing production capacity will not be enough. Additional sources will need to be created, including through transfer of technology. Once new health tools are developed, they will need to be equitably allocated between countries and within countries. This requires member states to agree how they will be done and to stick to this agreement. The most vulnerable and those at highest risk must be prioritized. The pricing of these tools must be as close as possible to what it costs to make them, so that they are affordable for health system and free to those most in need. Finally, we must require full transparency on R&D funding. Transparency is key to securing public trust and support and demonstrating that both governments and funding recipients are accountable for how these investments are used. We are at a critical junction. Member states and all stakeholders, including civil society, must act to ensure both new tools and equitable access to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bernard, for this sort of you're laying out very effectively the agenda for the next steps. I see there's a problem with my video. I do see myself. I think it's okay now. In any case, if my video does not work, you just have to do it with my voice, which is still holding out. So thank you, Bernard. These are really very, very important points, and also touch upon some of the questions that are coming in on the chat. And I hope that we can turn to those also when we have a little bit of time left. I would like to now introduce the final speaker of the panel, Mr. Charles Gore. He is the Executive Director of the Medicines Patent Pool. Charles, you run the MPP, the patent pool, which has shown the value of the mechanism, in particular in HIV and AIDS and hepatitis C and some other diseases. You have acted very quickly. You have expanded your mandate to be able to work on COVID-19 globally. What does that mean? How can the MPP contribute to this proposal and to this initiative? Charles, you have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed, Ellen, and for organizing this as well as facilitating it, and also to your co-organizers. Yes, back in February when we saw COVID really becoming a massive problem globally, we put out a statement saying that we were ready to help in any way that we could. And then at the beginning of April, our board decided to temporarily expand our mandate to any technology that could be useful for COVID-19, where licensing, which is our area of expertise, could help overcome barriers. And we felt that our experience and our expertise in public health licensing, which of course is different from commercial licensing, could be useful. And obviously, as you said, Ellen, thanks to you and Unitaid, when you set it up, we have now developed this experience and expertise, primarily in HIV, but as you said, also in hepatitis C, over 10 years. And during the course of that, that has meant that we have built relationships with many governments, the pharmaceutical industry, both originators and the generics, as well as key public health organizations that potentially make us able to have a meaningful contribution. What's really important to us, as it has been since you set it up, Ellen, is that we make sure that there is equitable access to everyone, no matter where they live. And although the focus of the Medicines Patent Pool has been on low and middle income countries, we do have some global licenses at the moment, one for Stazolid, and now our license for lopinavir and ritonavir has become global, a drug combination that might turn out to be useful for COVID. So to answer your question, what in practical terms does it mean, our expansion? Well, one of the things it means is that we need to reach out very early to potential IP holders of important drugs. Like everyone else, we're desperately looking at ways of compressing the time it takes. And so, for example, we're reaching out to a number of IP holders of medicines, but also of vaccines at the moment. And we are, in fact, I don't think it's any secret, in negotiations with Gilead around remdesivir. You'll have seen yesterday that Gilead has issued some bilateral licenses to 5 generic companies. Obviously, those are essentially commercial, at least from the point of view of the generic companies, and whereas as a licensee from Gilead, we have slightly different criteria, and so inevitably things perhaps take a little longer. In terms of looking at these drugs that may be useful, we've now got another 5 on top of remdesivir, their patent status on MedsPal, which is our patent and licensing database, which we feel could be useful. And in terms of the IP pool and this very important initiative from Costa Rica, we've been very closely in touch with both Costa Rica and WHO. And really what we said is that we're very happy to play whatever role the global community wants us to. And this will become, I think, more apparent as the details and the operationalization are worked out. At the moment, I think a lot of this is fairly top line. So exactly where we can help is something that's not completely clear, but we believe that the medicines patent pool can adapt to what is needed here. And we think it would be an enormous pity if there was a push to set up a whole new organization to run a patent pool. It may mean that we need to work in a rather different way, in particular to try and speed up our processes and streamline them. But what we feel is that there's something we can contribute here. And if we need to expand to do that, Unitaid have very kindly said that they will back us to do that, if we need, for example, to increase our capacity. But perhaps the key thing is, as has been mentioned a number of times, the willingness of the IP holders to put that IP into a pool, and incentivizing that through a number of ways that have been highlighted already is going to be critically important, and the role of civil society, but also governments and funders and so on, in making that happen is really going to be the key to making this initiative really work. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Charles. And it is very good to know that you, with the support of Unitaid, can in fact immediately start playing a role in this. But of course, we also understand that a lot more is necessary in terms of what needs to be brought together. We have a little bit of time left for questions and answer. We've got a number of questions that have come in on the Q&A, and I'm going to just pick out a few, and I apologize in advance because it will not be possible to address all of those, but I'm also quite sure that this is the beginning of a conversation and that we will meet again in various fora. The first question I'm going to take is from an anonymous attendee, so I cannot name the person, who writes, "This is a laudable initiative from the WHO for universal vaccine, but it seems 16 weeks late. Some teams are in phase 1 trial already. Unless WHO plans to provide universal access to whoever discovers an effective vaccine first, we may lose a few months in providing the vaccine to the third world." I would like to ask Jamie to respond to this question, but perhaps also the WHO would like to jump in. Jamie, you have the floor.
Yeah, it is late. And a lot of money is going out the door. You've got billions being thrown at the development of drugs, vaccines, and other diagnostic tests, all sorts of things. And what's important is in the funding contracts themselves, and Carlos mentioned this earlier, and I think Paul also mentioned this earlier, it's really important in the funding agreements that you address some of these issues about intellectual property, pricing, and affordability, and know-how. If you don't, under U.S. law, the default position, although there are exceptions in the law, but the default is that the intellectual property rights and all the rights and data and know-how vest with a contractor that receives the government money. And then afterwards, the government has some rights, but they're limited, particularly as relating to sharing globally, they're limited. And even in the United States, there's some controversy about how broad they can be. Once you privatize rights, Canada has a similar provision in their law. A lot of governments that we've looked at in Europe generally privatize the intellectual property rights under the grant and contracts they do. Now, because these things can often be addressed by contract, a policy decision early to have at least an option to share would be really important. We know that under US law and under Canadian law, for example, if there's an agreement between the US government or the Canadian government with the World Health Organization or some other entity, then they're allowed to include the provisions of that agreement in a licensing agreement to expand the rights, which would normally be available even for the US government to use patent rights in a pandemic, for example, order to address COVID-19. So the fact that a lot of money has gone out the door without these things being addressed has been important. Also it allows other the locus of attention to go elsewhere. Like now you have Gilead announcing these really objectionable bad licenses, which do not permit exports under a compulsory license to another country, and things like that. And you have CEPI announcing that it's going to have be opposing open licensing of patents and know-how. And you see sort of a shift of power to people that are out there acting. So the delays have not been helpful. And I don't want to be too critical of WHO in this because it's not only the WHO's fault, but we'd like to see things move fast. And we understand that things will be picked up a bit now, but yeah, it is 16 weeks late. I think that's true.
Thank you, Jamie. Of course, it doesn't prohibit from licensing once a product is developed or once a development project is in further stages, as we've also seen with the work of the medicines patent pool. But one of the commentators makes a very interesting observation. This comes from Janus Lasdins, who says we had in 2006 the Global Strategy and Plan of Action on Public Health, Innovation and Intellectual Property. Isn't it time to take this seriously and make the necessary commitments? Preparedness should not be seen as a firefighting initiative. Bit of a rhetoric question, perhaps, but of course he's got a point. It's not the first time that we talk about this, and how come that we now have to start building something that actually should have already been put in place. I'm looking at the time. There's I think an important question to address. There are many important questions actually, so it's not an easy job to pick them out. But here is one which I think I'm going to give to Carlos Correa by Svet Vijay, and I'm sure I mispronounced your name, apologies, about regional versus national IP intellectual property frameworks. If ARIPO member states reform national legislation to ease the process of compulsory licensing, does ARIPO's Harare protocol also need to be reformed so that member states can actually enjoy these flexibilities? It seems a relevant question at this time. Carlos, could you respond to that?
Well, thank you, Ellen. Maybe we need to check again the specific provisions. There may be enough there in order for the individual countries to use the compulsory license system. So, as you know, this is a very well known already flexibility and the TRIPS agreement. Most governments do know that these possibilities there, although it was already mentioned, has not been used very frequently. But maybe there is no need to review. What there may be a need of is to develop some guidelines for the governments to operate. Government use, as I mentioned, maybe is the most straightforward measure that can be used, because there is no need for a third party to request the use of a compulsory license. So I think we'll be happy to check this more in detail. But in principle, in the law themselves, you may have the basic elements, and there may be a need just to develop the procedures in order to make these measures effectively used.
Thank you. Thank you, Carlos. There's a question for Marie-Paule Kieny from Milut Kadar. What is Inserm France's response to the declaration by Sanofi on the priorities for the sales of COVID-19 vaccine and the fact that the United States will be served first in the event of the discovery and production of a vaccine by Sanofi? Is there an Inserm response to that? And if not, Marie-Paule, you can always, of course, respond in your personal capacity.
Well, there's an overall response in France to that, and everybody's appalled from the government down there. This is everywhere in the news, and I think this is really appalling myself on a personal ground. But I think also that this is simply also showing that when policymakers thought that globalization and capitalism would deal with everything perfectly based on demand and whatsoever, they were completely wrong. and then the health in particular, but over other sector must have a much stronger public involvement if we want all to be safe. So we will have to see how this evolves. But voices in France are quite strong about that. Over.
And I imagine so. Thank you, Marie-Paule. There's a question that we actually would have liked to ask to CEPI, but perhaps the WHO could come in on that, or anyone else who has the answer to this one. This question comes from Alan Story, who's a journalist, and he talked to a representative from CEPI, Mr. Wilder, who had said the Costa Rica proposal is, quote, not effective and not necessary. Mr. Wilder of CEPI told the journal that, sorry, there's a difficult to read, told this to the Green World last week in an exclusive interview.
Alan Story was the journalist.
Sorry?
Alan Story was the journalist. He's
yes,
one of the participants.
I believe I mentioned that. Alan Story, this question is from Alan Story. He's actually on the call, but he can't speak, so I'm speaking for him. Will this be the main fault line at the World Health Assembly? And shouldn't we be worried that Bill Gates is now the largest funder of the WHO? That's a bit of a difficult question, perhaps, to ask the WHO to respond to, but it would be good to hear from the WHO. And if others want to come in, just signal that to me.
I respond with pleasure, no problem. I think the General Legal Counsel's opinion about the patent pool is his opinion. It's not how we understand it's going to be useful or not. And there are still the way we are dealing with the fair allocation and the equitable access and the provisions and what needs to be in the funding agreements and so on, including with the European Commission, are still negotiations ongoing right now. Okay, so I wouldn't take this as a default position regarding the partners on the act accelerated. That's not the right position. Now, regarding the fault line at WJ, the negotiations are stuck, we're stuck on many places, but intellectual property is always sensitive. You know, in this, it's the same discussion in 2006 and last year with the transparency resolution, the year before with about 2 years ago, the updated recommendations of the DGS POA. So we're not talking about new problems at the member state level. And some member states are very consistent on their position. But we do see in recent years, there is a different coalition coming up because most of the people on this call know, because we have developed countries who are now very worried, rich context countries who are now very worried about the pricing of certain technologies. So there's a lot of leeway. There's a changed context at the WJ from what we had in 2006. Now, should we be worried that Bill Gates is now the largest funder of WHO? You should be worried if Bill Gates was telling WHO what to do. But Gates has been funding the area I direct, which is the regulatory issues and PQ work and the strengthening of regulatory capacity at country level. We have a great partnership with Gates in this aspect. Gates has been, together with Dr. Tedros, has also been pushing on the ACT accelerator and has been investing a lot of funds for example, in in scaling up capacity for manufacturers from the developing countries vaccines manufacturers network. They're investing a lot of money on scaling up capacity, because once we have one vaccine that's good enough, or 2 vaccines or 3 vaccines, we need to scale up dramatically. So, we were working with partners and with the member states to the extent possible, and And we are doing our best to bring these products to the market at affordable prices and to make sure that everybody who needs to get, and I'd like to add, Ellen, because someone talked about universal access to this vaccine. There won't be universal access first, because first we need to vaccinate, for example, across the globe, all health workers, all health line workers. That's different from universal access. And in different phases, proceeding to universal access to the vaccine. Sorry, I took too long.
No, not at all. And it's very good that you addressed that question, because in fact, there were many questions around that issue, the distribution, who decides who will get it first, etc. I am terribly, terribly sorry, but we're going to have to close this session. We've been talking to each other for an hour and a half. There are many more questions, many more issues to discuss. But in the few seconds that I have left, I would like to thank the speakers. I would like to in particular thank the Minister of Health of Costa Rica for making time to be on this panel, and for Roman Macaya to be so clear in explaining what they would like to achieve. I would like to thank all these speakers and the attendees around the world for having followed this conversation. It will not end here. There's a lot more work to be done, but I think we also hope that this made a meaningful contribution to the discussion at the World Health Assembly next week, which this time around cannot be business as usual. We actually need to see a dramatically different World Health Assembly spirit than what we have seen in previous years. So that is my concluding comment. I thank you all. We are going to close this meeting, but we hope that you will find us on the internet and continue to stay in touch and engage with us on this conversation and the action necessary to make this happen, because talk alone does not move mountains, and moving mountains is what we're going to have to do. Thank you all, and a great thank you to the high tech team who's made this all possible. It's all magic, but it's been a very, very good experience. Have a good afternoon.